My name is Daniel Mercer, and this happened when I was 29 years old during the winter of 2018. At the time, I worked as a freelance photographer specializing in abandoned places. Old hospitals, forgotten factories, deserted towns. Those were my favorite subjects. There was something fascinating about locations where life had once thrived and then suddenly stopped. That fascination is what brought me to a place called Silver Ridge, a ghost town hidden deep in the mountains of northern Canada. Silver Ridge had been a mining town in the 1930s. When the mine collapsed and several workers died, the town emptied almost overnight. By the 1950s, it was completely abandoned. At least, that's what the history books said. I had driven nearly 6 hours through snow-covered forest roads to reach it. The last 30 minutes of the drive were along a narrow dirt trail that barely looked like a road anymore. When the trees finally cleared, the town appeared in front of me. A cluster of broken wooden buildings sitting silently in the middle of a frozen valley. But something about it immediately felt wrong, because several windows were glowing with faint yellow light. And according to every record I had read, no one had lived there for over 70 years. At first, I assumed the lights had a simple explanation. Maybe another photographer had arrived before me. Maybe hikers were camping inside one of the buildings. It wouldn't have been the first time someone used an abandoned structure as shelter. Still, the deeper I drove into the town, the stranger things felt. The streets were covered in untouched snow, completely smooth and undisturbed. No footprints, no tire tracks, nothing. Yet the lights were definitely there. 3 houses near the center of town had faint illumination behind their cracked windows, like lanterns glowing somewhere inside. I parked my truck near what used to be the town's general store and stepped out into the cold. The silence was absolute. No wind, no birds, not even the sound of creaking wood. Just the distant glow of those windows staring back at me. I grabbed my camera and began walking toward the nearest house. The deeper I moved into the town, the stronger the feeling grew that I was being watched. And then I noticed something that made the hairs on my neck stand up. Footprints. But they weren't human. Those footprints stopped me in my tracks. They stretched across the snow between 2 houses, heading toward the glowing window of a small wooden cabin. At first glance, they looked almost human. But something about them was wrong. Each print was too long, too narrow. And the spacing between them was strange, like whatever made them had taken impossibly long steps. I crouched down and examined one through my camera lens. The edges were sharp, meaning the print was fresh. Very fresh. But the snow around it was completely undisturbed. No drag marks, no signs of someone walking normally through the street. Just a single trail of those unnatural prints moving silently across the town. A cold wave of unease crawled through my chest. I told myself it was probably an animal. Maybe a deer with a strange gait or something similar. Still, the trail led directly to the cabin with the glowing window, and my curiosity had always been stronger than my fear. So, gripping my camera tightly, I followed the footprints across the frozen street toward the light. By the time I reached the cabin porch, the footprints had suddenly stopped. Right in front of the door, the wooden porch creaked under my boots as I stepped closer. Up close, the cabin looked even older than the others. The wood was dark and warped with age, and several boards had split apart from decades of freezing winters. But the light inside was real. A soft yellow glow flickered through the dusty window like a lantern burning somewhere deep in the room. I pressed my face against the glass and tried to see inside. At first, all I could make out was a table and a chair sitting in the center of the room. Then the light flickered slightly, and I realized something that made my stomach tighten. There was no lantern, no lamp, no candle. The entire room was glowing faintly, as if the light itself was coming from nowhere. I slowly stepped back from the window. That was when I heard it. A quiet sound behind me. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Footsteps moving slowly through the snow somewhere in the darkness of the town. But when I turned around, the street behind me was completely empty. I stood frozen on the porch, staring into the empty street. The sound had been clear, heavy footsteps crunching slowly through the snow behind me. But now the town looked completely still again. For a few seconds, I wondered if the noise had just been snow falling from a roof or a branch snapping somewhere in the forest. Then I heard it again. Crunch. This time it was closer. The sound came from somewhere between the buildings across the street. I lifted my camera and aimed the lens toward the darkness between the houses. Through the zoom, I could see a narrow alley between two leaning wooden structures. At first, there was nothing there. Just drifting fog and deep shadow. Then something moved. A tall shape passed slowly across the far end of the alley. It was too dark to see clearly, but the movement was unmistakable. Someone, or something, had just walked between the buildings. My first instinct was that another explorer had arrived in the town. But the shape I saw had been wrong somehow. Too tall and far too thin. I stepped off the porch and slowly moved toward the alley. My heart was pounding now, but curiosity pushed me forward. If someone else was here, I wanted to see who it was. Remote places like this often attracted urban explorers, and sometimes people traveled hundreds of miles just to photograph towns like Silver Ridge. But as I crossed the street, I noticed something disturbing. There were no footprints leading toward the alley. The snow there was completely untouched. The only trail in the entire street was the strange set of elongated prints that had led me to the cabin. I stopped about 10 feet from the alley entrance and raised my camera again. "Hello?" I called out. My voice echoed faintly between the empty buildings. No response. For several seconds, nothing moved. Then, deep inside the darkness of the alley, I heard a faint sound. Not footsteps, not breathing. It sounded more like whispering, soft voices murmuring together somewhere beyond the shadows. But the words weren't English, and there were far too many voices for just one person. The whispering continued, drifting faintly through the alley like a cold breeze carrying distant voices. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just the wind moving through broken boards or empty chimneys. Old buildings make strange noises, especially in places abandoned for decades. But this wasn't wind. The sounds rose and fell like people quietly speaking to each other. I leaned slightly closer to the alley entrance, straining to listen. The whispers immediately stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. I stood there for several seconds, waiting for the voices to start again. But the town remained perfectly still. That was when I noticed something inside the alley. Near the far end, partially hidden by darkness, there was a doorway leading into another building. A faint yellow glow was spilling out from inside. Another light. And just like the cabin, the snow outside that doorway was completely untouched. No footprints going in, no footprints coming out. Yet the whispers had clearly come from that direction. I swallowed hard and took a slow step forward into the alley. The deeper I moved, the colder the air became. And the whispers started again. By the time I reached the glowing doorway, the whispering had grown louder. Not loud enough to understand, but clear enough that I could tell there were multiple voices speaking at once. It sounded like a group of people murmuring together in a language I didn't recognize. I stood just outside the doorway and slowly raised my camera again. The room inside looked like what used to be a small office. There was an old wooden desk against one wall, a broken filing cabinet tipped over in the corner, and papers scattered across the floor. But the strangest thing was the light. Just like the cabin earlier, there was no lamp, no lantern, nothing producing the glow. The entire room was simply filled with that same faint yellow illumination. And yet, it was empty, completely empty. The whispers stopped the moment I stepped into the doorway. I turned slowly, scanning every corner of the room. Nothing moved, nothing breathed. But then, my camera screen flickered slightly. And when I glanced down at the display, I realized the camera was capturing something my eyes couldn't see. Shapes, standing all around me. For a moment, I thought my camera had glitched. I blinked and looked at the room again with my own eyes. Still empty. But when I raised the camera screen back in front of me, the display showed something completely different. Figures, dozens of them. They stood silently throughout the room, surrounding the desk, the broken cabinet, even the doorway behind me. Their shapes were faint and distorted, like silhouettes made of smoke, but they were clearly human in form. Every single one of them was facing me. My breathing grew shallow as I slowly turned in place, keeping the camera raised. Through the screen, I could see them everywhere, standing shoulder to shoulder, watching. Some appeared tall, others shorter, like men, women, maybe even children, and none of them moved. Then one of the shapes slowly lifted its arm. The motion was slow and unnatural, like an old film playing at the wrong speed. On the camera screen, the figure was pointing directly toward the doorway. Behind me, my heart began hammering as I slowly lowered the camera. The room looked empty again, but the silence felt different now. Heavier, almost expectant. I turned toward the doorway the figure had pointed at. The alley outside was dark and still, just like before. But something had changed. The snow outside the door was no longer untouched. Fresh footprints had appeared, dozens of them. Long, narrow prints stretching across the alley in every direction, like a crowd had suddenly gathered there. I slowly raised the camera again, and this time I pointed it toward the doorway. The screen lit up with movement. Outside, the alley was filled with the same shadowy figures standing in the snow, watching the building. Watching me. One by one, they began stepping forward. The camera screen flickered violently, and the whispers returned, louder than before. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran. I left Silver Ridge that night and never returned. But when I later reviewed the photos I had taken, one image showed something standing directly behind me inside the room. Something that hadn't been there while I was looking. My name is Marcus Hale, and this happened in October of 2019 when I was 34 years old. At the time, I worked as a structural inspector for abandoned properties across northern Canada. Most of my job involved visiting old mining towns and logging camps that had been left empty for decades. The government wanted to know if any of the remaining buildings were dangerous or at risk of collapsing. That's how I ended up driving toward a ghost town called Hollow Creek. Hollow Creek had once been a small logging community deep in the forests of British Columbia. In the late 1970s, the lumber company that supported the town shut down suddenly, and most of the residents moved away within months. By the early 1980s, the town had been completely abandoned. Or at least, that's what the official record said. But when I picked up the inspection file from my supervisor, there was a handwritten note attached to the front page. It simply said, "One resident may still remain." At first, I assumed it meant some old squatter or hermit living out there. But when I arrived at Hollow Creek later that afternoon, the town looked far too empty for anyone to still be alive there. Hollow Creek sat in the middle of a narrow valley surrounded by thick forest. The road leading into town looked like it hadn't been used in years. Fallen branches covered parts of the path, and weeds had grown up through the cracked dirt. As I slowly drove past the first few buildings, I noticed the same thing over and over again. Everything had been left behind. Old pickup trucks sat rusting in driveways. Children's bicycles lay tipped over near empty houses. Even a faded swing set stood motionless in what used to be the town's small playground. It looked less like people had moved away and more like they had simply vanished. I parked near the center of town beside what had once been the community store. Before getting out, I double-checked the note again. "One resident may still remain." I scanned the empty street in front of me. Every house looked abandoned. Every window was dark. But just as I reached for the door handle, something caught my eye in the reflection of the truck's side mirror. Someone was standing in the middle of the road behind me, watching the truck. At first, I thought the figure in the mirror was just my imagination. Long drives through isolated areas can mess with your mind, especially when you're alone in places where no one has lived for decades. But when I slowly turned around in my seat, the figure was still there, standing in the center of the road. It was an old man. He looked extremely thin, almost fragile, and he wore what looked like an old logging jacket that might have been decades old. His gray beard hung unevenly across his chest, and his face was pale and deeply wrinkled. But the thing that unsettled me the most was how still he stood. He wasn't waving. He wasn't walking toward me. He was simply staring, watching the truck without moving a single inch. For a moment, I wondered if he might need help. Someone living alone out here for years could easily get sick or injured. So I stepped out of the truck and called out to him. "Sir, are you the resident listed in the town records?" The old man didn't answer. He just kept staring at me, like he had been waiting for me to arrive. I walked a few steps closer, trying to appear calm and non-threatening. "Hi there," I said again, raising a hand slightly. "My name's Marcus. I'm here for a property inspection." The old man finally moved, but not the way I expected. Instead of speaking, he slowly turned his head to the side and looked down the empty street behind him. For a moment, I thought he was ignoring me. Then he lifted one hand and pointed toward one of the houses farther down the road. The building looked older than most of the others. The roof had partially collapsed, and the front porch leaned slightly to one side, like it had been slowly sinking for years. "That where you live?" I asked. The old man slowly turned his head back toward me. For the first time, I saw his eyes clearly. They looked strangely dull, almost cloudy. Not blind exactly, but unfocused, like he wasn't fully seeing the world around him. Then he spoke in a low, rough voice that sounded like it hadn't been used in a long time. "You shouldn't stay here after dark." And without another word, he started walking toward the broken house. For a few seconds, I just stood there watching the old man walk away. His movements were slow and stiff, like someone whose body had grown used to years of isolation. Each step seemed careful, deliberate, as if he had walked those same few streets thousands of times before. I glanced up at the sky. The sun was already beginning to sink behind the mountains surrounding the valley, casting long shadows across the empty town. His warning echoed in my mind. "You shouldn't stay here after dark." Normally, I would have brushed something like that off as the rambling of a lonely hermit. But something about the way he said it, calm, certain, almost tired, made it sound less like advice and more like a fact. Still, I had a job to do. The inspection report required photographs and structural notes from several buildings around town. So I grabbed my equipment from the truck and started toward the old community store first. As I walked down the empty street, I glanced back once. The old man had reached the leaning house he pointed at. And just before he stepped inside, he looked back at me. For a moment, I could swear he looked worried. The inside of the community store looked like time had frozen sometime around 1978. Dust covered every surface, and shelves that once held food and supplies were now mostly empty, with a few rusted cans and faded packaging still scattered across them. Near the counter, an old cash register sat half open, as if someone had been in the middle of closing the store when everything suddenly stopped. I began taking photos for the inspection report. Broken beams, collapsed ceiling sections, water damage along the back wall. Everything seemed normal for a place abandoned for 40 years. But as I moved deeper into the building, something began to bother me. The dust on the floor had been disturbed. At first, the marks were faint, just small streaks cutting through the thick layer of gray powder. Then I reached the center aisle and froze. Footprints, fresh ones. They moved slowly between the shelves, circling the store like someone had been walking there recently. But they didn't lead toward the door. Instead, they disappeared in the middle of the floor. I stepped back from the footprints, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe an animal had somehow gotten in. Maybe the old man had entered the store and wandered around earlier. But that made no sense. I had watched him enter the leaning house down the street. He hadn't gone into the store. I swallowed hard and decided to check the back of the building. Slowly, I approached a broken doorway leading into what used to be the storage room. As I peeked inside, my blood ran cold. The room was empty, but the air felt thick, almost heavy. The faint smell of wood smoke lingered, even though the chimney was broken and the fireplace had been cold for decades. Then I heard it. A soft scraping sound, like fingernails dragging across wood. It was coming from the ceiling beams above me. I froze, my camera hanging at my side as the scraping grew louder and closer. Whatever it was moving right above me. I barely breathed as I tried to pinpoint the source of the noise. The scraping moved across the beams above me, slow and deliberate, almost like something was walking along the ceiling. I stepped back toward the doorway, keeping my eyes fixed upward. My instincts screamed at me to run, but curiosity kept me rooted in place. Then, suddenly, a shadow passed along the far wall. It was thin, impossibly tall, and moved in a jerky, unnatural way. My stomach twisted as I realized it wasn't the old man. The shadow stopped near the center of the room, just beyond the frozen footprints. A low, raspy whisper came from the darkness. "You shouldn't be here." My blood ran cold. The voice wasn't human. It was hollow, layered, as if several people were speaking at once through a single throat. I stumbled backward and almost tripped over the broken counter. The room felt alive now, like it was watching me, waiting. And I knew, without a doubt, that the old man hadn't been warning me. He had been protecting me. I froze in place, staring at the footprints. They didn't belong to any ordinary person. The prints were unnaturally long and narrow, like someone had stretched their feet unnaturally to walk. Even stranger, they moved in a slow circular pattern, almost as if the person, or whatever it was, had been pacing in place for hours. The air grew colder. I felt it on my skin, a sharp, biting chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air outside. I slowly raised my camera to take a picture of the strange marks. The screen flickered, showing something I couldn't see with my naked eyes. Faint, shadowy silhouettes moving around the store in the dim light, surrounding the shelves, the counters, the aisles. I dropped the camera in shock. When I looked up, the store appeared empty again. But then I heard it, a faint whispering from the back of the store. The voices weren't in any language I recognized. They murmured together, low and urgent, like a warning. My heart hammered in my chest as I realized I wasn't alone. I backed toward the door, my hands trembling. The whispering grew louder, more urgent, echoing through the empty aisles. I glanced at the back of the store and saw something I will never forget. The old man, who had seemed frail and harmless, was standing in the corner, but his eyes were glowing faint yellow, unnatural and piercing through the darkness. He didn't speak, he didn't move. Yet somehow, I felt his gaze pressing into me, cold and heavy, as if weighing my very soul. Then, as I stepped closer to the exit, the shadows in the corners began shifting. Figures emerged, tall and thin, moving silently among the dusty shelves. Their shapes were barely visible in the dim light, but their presence filled the room with a palpable sense of dread. I ran. I didn't stop until I was back in my truck, fumbling with the keys. I never returned to Hollow Creek. But the photos I took that day revealed something I couldn't explain. Dozens of shadowy figures standing silently behind the old man, staring directly at me. My name is Eleanor James, and this happened when I was 26 years old, during the summer of 2020. I worked as a documentary filmmaker focusing on abandoned mining towns across Canada. My goal was to capture the history, architecture, and atmosphere of these forgotten places before time erased them completely. One of the locations that caught my attention was Black Hollow, a mining town in northern Ontario that had been abandoned for nearly 70 years. It was rumored that the mines beneath the town had collapsed mysteriously, leaving workers trapped inside. Most townspeople had fled overnight, leaving their homes, belongings, and lives behind. I drove for hours along a winding forest road before reaching the outskirts of Black Hollow. As soon as I entered the town, an unsettling feeling washed over me. The streets were silent, the buildings leaning and rotting, and the air carried a faint metallic scent, as if the earth itself was bleeding. I parked near the old mine entrance, a gaping maw of darkness in the side of a hill. I knew I was supposed to film inside, but the shadows within seemed almost alive. The entrance to the mine loomed over me like a jagged black scar in the hillside. The air around it was colder, heavier, and carried a faint whispering sound that I thought was the wind at first. I grabbed my camera and flashlight, reminding myself that I had to capture everything for my documentary. The sun was low, casting long shadows through the collapsed structures of the town, making them look like specters frozen in time. As I approached the mine's mouth, the whispers grew clearer. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable, urgent, almost pleading. My heart began to race. I shone the flashlight into the mine. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating jagged rock walls and old timber supports that had been partially collapsed. Deep inside, I thought I saw movement, but it vanished before my eyes. A cold draft blew from the tunnel, carrying a metallic scent stronger than before, and the whispering swirled around me, coming from every direction at once. I took a deep breath and stepped into the mine, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the thick darkness. The air was heavy, damp, and smelled of rusted metal and decay. Each step echoed unnaturally against the stone walls, amplifying the whispering that seemed to be coming from all directions at once. As I moved further inside, I noticed old mining tools scattered across the ground, pickaxes, helmets, and wooden supports splintered from years of neglect. Shadows stretched and shifted as I passed, and I could have sworn some of them weren't my own. Then I saw it. Faint marks on the walls, like scratch marks made by fingernails, stretching higher than any human could reach. They formed patterns, jagged and chaotic, but somehow deliberate. My stomach tightened. The whispers grew louder, now clearly coming from the end of a narrow passageway deeper inside the mine. I tried calling out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" But my voice only seemed to anger the shadows. The whispers became frantic, circling me, pressing in closer. I forced myself to move deeper, toward the source of the whispers. The narrow passageway twisted downward, and the temperature dropped rapidly. My breath came out in visible clouds as I struggled to keep my flashlight steady. Halfway through, I stumbled upon a skeleton, still wearing a rusted helmet, slumped against the wall. Its jaw hung open as if screaming silently, and the bones looked impossibly pale against the dark rock. I recoiled, feeling a wave of nausea. Then I heard it clearly. A voice whispering my name. "Eleanor. Eleanor." My flashlight flickered as I spun around, but the passage was empty behind me. The whispering didn't stop. It circled closer, moving faster than I could follow. I realized with a sickening certainty that the voices were not coming from a single source. They were coming from everywhere. From the walls, the ceiling, the shadows themselves. I could feel them pressing into me, like cold hands grazing my skin, urging me forward. I had no choice but to continue. The deeper I went, the more oppressive the mine became. Every step echoed like a drumbeat in a vast, hollow chamber, and the whispering voices grew louder, overlapping in a chaotic chorus that I couldn't make sense of. My flashlight caught glimpses of shadows moving along the walls, darting just outside the beam, disappearing before I could focus on them. I stumbled across a section of the floor that had collapsed decades ago. Jagged rocks jutted out like teeth, and beneath them, a faint orange glow pulsed, as if the earth itself was breathing. The whispers seemed to radiate from that glow, calling me closer, urging me to peer into the darkness. Despite every instinct screaming at me to run, I leaned over the edge of the collapsed floor. My flashlight trembled in my hands, and the whispers intensified, forming words I could almost understand. "Join us. Forever." A cold wind rushed from the depths, extinguishing the flashlight for a second, plunging me into darkness so absolute it felt alive. The moment the flashlight flickered back on, I froze. Figures. A dozen shadowy forms were moving just beyond the glow, tall and thin, their outlines barely visible in the half-darkness. Their faces were featureless, yet somehow I could feel their gaze boring into me. They swayed slightly, as if floating above the uneven rocks, gliding silently through the chamber. I stumbled backward, heart hammering. The whispers rose into a chorus of anguished cries, echoing off the stone walls. "Eleanor, join us. Forever." I tried to run, but my foot caught on a broken timber, sending me sprawling onto the hard, damp rock. The shadows moved closer, gliding over the rocks without making a sound. I scrambled to my feet, dragging myself toward the mine entrance, every step feeling heavier, like the darkness itself was trying to pull me down. As I neared the mouth of the mine, a figure emerged from the deepest shadows. A miner, or at least what remained of one. His eyes glowed faintly orange, matching the pulsing light below. And he smiled. I froze in place, my chest tight and my breath shallow. The figure's glowing eyes seemed to pierce my very soul. I wanted to run, but my legs refused to move. The whispers had grown into a deafening chorus, each voice overlapping the other, urgent and insistent. The glowing miner lifted one hand, pointing toward the pulsing light deep in the collapsed section of the mine. I could see now that the shadows were moving in unison, slowly advancing toward me, surrounding me, guiding me toward the abyss. Panic clawed at me, but some inexplicable force compelled me to step closer to the glow. The closer I got, the stronger the pull of the light became, like gravity bending toward the heart of the darkness. Shapes began forming in the glow, humanoid but distorted, with elongated limbs and faceless heads. The whispers became words I could understand. "You belong with us, forever." I realized then that the miners had never truly left Black Hollow. They had changed. I stumbled backward, heart hammering, and the shadows surged forward, filling the chamber. The whispering voices now surrounded me, echoing off the walls and ceiling, filling every inch of the mine with their oppressive presence. My flashlight flickered wildly, and I could barely make out the silhouettes of the figures moving toward me. The glowing miner extended both hands toward the abyss, as if beckoning me into the pulsing light. The other shadows moved in a synchronized, almost hypnotic rhythm, guiding me forward like predators encircling their prey. Every instinct screamed to flee. Yet my body felt rooted in place, drawn by an invisible force. I screamed, trying to break free, but the pulsing light reached out to touch me, its warmth strangely alluring despite the terror. The walls themselves seemed to breathe, closing in. I realized that the mine was alive, feeding on those who entered, keeping the lost miners trapped forever. I had come for a story, but now I understood. Black Hollow claimed anyone who dared step inside. My lungs burned as I forced myself to move backward, stumbling over broken rocks and old timbers. The shadows followed, gliding silently, their faceless forms undeterred by my panic. The pulsing light from the abyss seemed to stretch toward me, tendrils of orange brilliance reaching like grasping fingers. I tripped and fell hard, scraping my hands on the jagged rocks. The whispers roared now, overwhelming, layering every syllable with dread. I realized that the voices weren't just calling me. They were inside me, echoing in my mind, tugging at something deep, something I hadn't known existed. Desperation forced me to my feet. I sprinted toward the faint daylight at the mine's mouth, every step a struggle against an invisible pull from the depths. Behind me, the shadows surged, rushing faster now. I felt their cold energy brush against my skin, tugging at my arms, my legs, my very being. I lunged through the mine entrance and collapsed into the forest outside, gasping for air. The whispers faded, replaced by the rustle of leaves and the distant call of birds. Yet I knew I hadn't escaped entirely. I collapsed onto the forest floor, trembling and soaked in sweat, my flashlight still clutched in my hand. For a long moment, the only sound was my ragged breathing. The mine behind me looked like an ordinary dark hole in the hillside, the pulsing light gone, the shadows invisible. But then I noticed something terrifying on the flashlight's camera display. The images I had captured inside the mine showed them all, the miners, distorted and elongated, standing in the pulsing orange light. They weren't static. Some had reached out, their faceless forms stretching toward me. I realized with horror that whatever had followed me wasn't confined to the mine. A single shadow appeared just outside the entrance, its form flickering in and out of visibility. I scrambled to my truck, heart hammering. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town, but the shadows haunted my peripheral vision for hours afterward. Black Hollow isn't abandoned, it's waiting, and it never forgets. My name is Lucas Trent, and this happened when I was 29, during a solo summer road trip in 2018. I had been traveling through Ontario, exploring abandoned towns and taking photographs for a personal project. One town in particular caught my attention: Redwater Hollow, a small settlement that had vanished from official maps decades ago. Locals still whispered about it, but no one seemed willing to say why. When I arrived, the town was eerily quiet. The houses were mostly intact, but the streets were empty, lawns overgrown, and children's toys lay scattered as if their owners had disappeared mid-play. The air smelled faintly of mildew and rust, and a fog hung low among the trees surrounding the town, swallowing the lower floors of the houses. I parked near the center of town, beside what had once been the general store, and grabbed my camera. My curiosity burned stronger than my fear, and I reminded myself that I was only here to document history. But something about Redwater Hollow didn't feel historical. It felt alive. As I walked down the main street, I noticed the signs of abrupt abandonment. Doors were left ajar, window curtains fluttered in the slight breeze, and a half-eaten loaf of bread sat on a kitchen table visible through a shattered window. The deeper I went, the stronger the feeling of being watched became. Every few steps, I thought I saw shadows moving inside the houses, just beyond my line of sight. I told myself it was the fog, or my imagination running wild in the isolated town. I reached the old church at the edge of town. Its wooden steeple leaned dangerously, and the bell had long since fallen silent. As I stepped inside, the air grew colder, almost unnatural, and the floorboards creaked under my weight. Then I saw it. Faded photographs of families lined the walls, yellowed with age. Every picture had been carefully turned to face the entrance, as if the people in them were watching me. And that's when I first heard the whisper. I froze at the whisper, my heart hammering in my chest. It wasn't loud, just a soft, almost sigh-like sound. But it carried an unmistakable urgency. I turned slowly, trying to locate its source, but the church appeared empty. Only the faded photographs stared back at me, their subjects frozen in time, their eyes unnervingly lifelike. I moved cautiously down the aisle, my flashlight sweeping across broken pews and a collapsed altar. The whisper came again, closer this time, almost as if it was moving along the walls, circling me. "Leave. Now," it murmured. My hands shook as I reached the pulpit, where an old journal rested atop the rotted wood. Its pages were brittle, and the writing inside was frantic, describing families vanishing one by one, every adult and child gone without a trace, leaving only empty homes behind. The more I read, the heavier the air became, pressing down on my chest. A faint creaking sound echoed behind me, and I realized I wasn't alone. Shadows moved at the edges of the room, twisting and flickering in the dim light. I turned to leave, but the main door slammed shut with a deafening crack, sending a cloud of dust into the air. Panic surged through me. The whispers multiplied, layering on top of each other, voices of adults, children, and something else I couldn't identify. They called my name, pleading and angry at the same time. The photographs on the walls shifted subtly, faces tilting toward me as if the people in them were alive. I stumbled backward, almost tripping over a broken pew, and caught sight of a shadow moving across the far end of the room. It was tall, hunched, and humanoid, but its limbs were too long, its head too small. A cold breeze brushed past my face, carrying with it a metallic, iron-like scent, like blood long dried. The whispering intensified, now coming from beneath the floorboards themselves. Each step I took seemed to echo into the hollow town, and I felt the weight of 100 unseen eyes following me. I realized that Redwater Hollow wasn't empty. It had never been empty. I forced myself to calm down and left the church, stepping into the fog-laden streets of Redwater Hollow. The town felt alive now, almost breathing beneath the mist. Every house I passed seemed to shift subtly, doors creaking open and closed, windows reflecting shadows that weren't mine. The whispers followed me, ebbing and flowing like waves, pulling me toward the largest home in the center of town, a mansion that had long since been abandoned. Its front door was cracked open, and the air that spilled out smelled faintly of decay and old wood. I hesitated at the threshold, but something, a combination of fear and curiosity, pushed me inside. The house was silent at first, the floorboards groaning beneath each step. Then, faint giggles echoed from the second floor, high-pitched and fleeting. I froze, listening. The voices whispered my name again, faster this time, more urgent, almost panicked. It was then I noticed the walls. Every photograph in the house, every family portrait, had their faces scratched out, except for one figure in each, the one that seemed to be watching me. I climbed the staircase slowly, my flashlight shaking in my hands. Each step creaked loudly, echoing through the empty hallways. The whispers intensified, surrounding me from all directions, coming from the walls, floors, and ceilings alike. I realized that the mansion itself seemed to know I was there. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched endlessly, lined with closed doors. Each door vibrated subtly, like a heartbeat, and shadows moved behind them. One door at the far end slowly creaked open, revealing a dimly lit nursery. Dust covered the crib, but toys on the floor were neatly arranged, as if waiting for children who would never return. A sudden draft slammed the door behind me, trapping me inside the hallway. The whispers converged, repeating a single phrase. "They're still here, watching." My flashlight flickered, and in the brief darkness, I thought I saw dozens of tiny, pale hands pressing against the walls, reaching for me. I understood then that the families had never left Redwater Hollow. They had vanished, but something remained, hungry for company. I pressed forward toward the nursery, every step heavier than the last. The whispers were relentless now, overlapping voices of adults, children, and something else entirely. Something cold and alien. I felt their presence pressing against my skin, like invisible fingers brushing along my arms, tugging at me with an almost playful cruelty. The nursery door creaked wider, revealing a small rocking chair moving gently back and forth on its own. The crib's mobile spun slowly, the faint shadows of dolls twisting into grotesque shapes as I shined my flashlight on them. Then I noticed the floorboards were wet, dark liquid seeping through the cracks, forming patterns that resembled tiny, clawed footprints leading to a corner of the room. I knelt to inspect it, heart hammering. The whispers surged into a chorus of warning and plea. "Stay. Join us." In the corner, the shadows coalesced into humanoid forms. Children, their faces pale, eyes hollow, staring directly at me. I realized then that these were not memories, not echoes. They were prisoners, trapped in the house, and they were trying to claim me. I stumbled backward, nearly toppling over the wet floor, my flashlight flickering violently. The whispers became louder, almost deafening, the words overlapping. "Stay, stay, forever." I turned to run, but the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly behind me. Every door I passed rattled violently, shadows slipping through the cracks like smoke, reaching for me. Panic surged. I felt my mind waver under the weight of their presence, my body freezing despite the urge to escape. The shadows in the nursery began moving toward the hallway, stretching unnaturally long. Faces twisted into impossible expressions of longing and anger. In a sudden moment of clarity, I bolted, crashing through a side door that led into the overgrown garden. The fog swallowed me immediately, hiding the mansion behind a veil of white mist. Yet, even outside, I could hear the whispers, faint but insistent, following me across the empty streets. Redwater Hollow wasn't a ghost town. It was a trap. And the families? They were still waiting, hungry for the next visitor. I ran blindly through the foggy streets of Redwater Hollow, my lungs burning and my heart hammering. Every step echoed unnaturally against the empty buildings, and I could hear the whispers trailing behind me, persistent and cruel. The fog thickened, wrapping around me like a living thing, slowing my movement, hiding what I could barely see. A dozen shadowy forms flitting between houses, barely visible, their hollow eyes fixed on me. I stumbled upon the town square, the fountain cracked and dry, but the stone basin shimmered with an unnatural reflection. In it, I could see dozens of pale faces staring back at me, some screaming silently, others smiling with twisted anticipation. The whispers rose to a chorus of panic and longing, surrounding me in every direction. Then I saw the mansion at the far edge of town. Its windows glowed faintly, the shadows from inside spilling into the fog. I realized the house was calling me back, promising answers, but at a cost I wasn't sure I could survive. Desperate, I ran toward the edge of town, finally reaching a forested path that led back to the main road. The whispers followed, distant but insistent, echoing from the town behind me. I glanced back once, and in the faint glow of the mansion's windows, I saw dozens of figures standing silently at every doorway, watching me leave. I didn't stop running until I reached my truck. Fumbling with the keys, I felt the weight of countless eyes on me, even as I drove away. When I glanced in the rearview mirror, the fog had swallowed Redwater Hollow entirely, leaving only empty forest behind. Later, reviewing the photos I'd taken inside the town, I saw them clearly. Pale figures in the shadows, elongated and distorted, watching, waiting. The last photograph, taken outside the mansion, showed dozens of hands pressing against the windows from the inside. I've never returned, and I never will. Redwater Hollow is alive, and it still wants its families back, and anyone else who dares to enter. My name is Amelia Clark, and this happened when I was 24, during a weekend photography trip in 2019. I had always been drawn to abandoned places, particularly cemeteries, where history lingered in the air like a thick perfume. One place that intrigued me more than any other was Pine Ridge Cemetery, located on the outskirts of a small, long-forgotten town in Nova Scotia. The locals spoke of it in hushed tones, claiming the graves were restless and the spirits unfriendly. Arriving at dusk, the cemetery appeared endless, a vast field of weathered tombstones leaning at odd angles, some cracked or half buried in earth and roots. Mist rolled across the ground, obscuring pathways and making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. As I stepped through the rusty iron gates, a cold wind whispered through the pines surrounding the cemetery, carrying faint, unintelligible voices. My flashlight cut a narrow path through the fog, illuminating names that had not been spoken for generations. Something about this place felt alive. I wandered deeper into Pine Ridge Cemetery, my footsteps muffled by the thick layer of fallen pine needles. The whispering voices grew faintly louder, almost like a chorus of mournful sighs carried on the wind. Shadows stretched unnaturally between the tombstones, bending with the fading light. Some graves were unmarked, simple mounds of earth, while others bore names I didn't recognize, etched in fading stone. One tomb in particular drew my attention, larger than the others, surrounded by twisted roots that seemed to grip it like skeletal hands. The air here was colder, heavy with an almost metallic scent that made my stomach churn. I set my camera on a tripod to capture the atmosphere, adjusting for the fog and dimming light. That's when I noticed movement. A figure, pale and indistinct, standing between the tombstones ahead. My breath caught. I lifted the camera, but the figure vanished the moment I aimed the lens in its direction. The whispers grew louder, almost chanting, and I realized I was not alone. I forced myself to move forward, each step cautious and deliberate. The fog thickened, curling around the tombstones like living fingers, and the whispers became clearer, overlapping voices murmuring my name. I could feel the cold brush against my skin, even through my jacket, as if invisible hands were trailing along my arms. The figure reappeared, closer this time, hovering just above the ground. Its face was obscured, but I could feel its gaze locked on me. Shadows shifted unnaturally around it, stretching toward me with every step I took. I tried to call out, but my voice was swallowed by the oppressive air. Then I noticed something even more disturbing. Footprints. Small, pale impressions in the soft earth, leading from the far side of the cemetery directly toward me. They glowed faintly in the fog, pulsing as if alive. I realized with a shiver that the figure was following the path, not me. It was being guided, drawn by something unseen. The cemetery wasn't abandoned. It was waiting. I stumbled into the center of the cemetery, heart hammering, flashlight flickering. The fog swirled violently, and the whispers became a chorus, urgent and pleading. I tried to focus, but the tombstones seemed to shift in the periphery of my vision, moving closer, leaning toward me as if drawn by the same unseen force that guided the figure. Ahead, I saw a mausoleum I hadn't noticed before. Its doors were ajar, blackness yawning like a mouth waiting to swallow anything that approached. The figure hovered closer to it, joined now by faint silhouettes emerging from behind tombstones, their forms twisted and humanoid, but impossibly thin. The whispers grew into words I could understand. Join us. Stay forever. I felt a cold wind push against me, forcing me closer to the mausoleum. Roots twisted around the stone steps, pulsing slightly as if alive, gripping the earth. The figure turned its obscured face toward me, and I realized that whatever haunted Pine Ridge Cemetery had been waiting for decades. And now, it had found me. I hesitated at the steps of the mausoleum, my flashlight trembling in my hands. The doors seemed impossibly heavy, yet it creaked open as if pushed by an unseen force. Inside, the air was thick, suffocating, carrying a metallic tang that made my stomach churn. The walls were lined with niches, each containing a small, dust-covered coffin. The whispers swirled around me, growing louder, each voice overlapping the other, almost pleading, almost angry. As I moved deeper, I noticed the shadows shifting along the walls. They weren't static. They slithered like smoke, sometimes forming humanoid shapes with long, spindly limbs and featureless faces. One reached out toward me, and I instinctively recoiled. The whispers seemed to urge me forward, guiding me toward a central coffin, larger than the others, with intricate carvings of twisted faces writhing in anguish. I felt a pull from the coffin, an irresistible force drawing me closer. My rational mind screamed to stop, but my body moved forward against my will, stepping into the darkness that seemed alive. The central coffin loomed before me, pulsing subtly, as though it were breathing. The whispers became deafening, layering a chorus of voices, each calling my name in different tones. Pleading, angry, mournful. I could feel the shadows pressing closer, curling along the floor and walls, stretching toward me like living fingers. Suddenly, the lid of the coffin slid open slowly, with no sound, revealing an empty interior. But as I peered inside, a pale hand shot out, gripping the edge with unnatural strength. I screamed and stumbled backward, my flashlight swinging wildly, casting long, flickering shadows across the mausoleum. From the corners of the room, more hands emerged from other coffins, some humanoid, others grotesquely elongated. They grasped for me, clawing at my clothing and skin. I realized that this place didn't just contain the dead. It was feeding on them, growing stronger with each visitor it trapped. With a surge of adrenaline, I tore myself away and bolted toward the entrance, the whispers following me relentlessly, promising that it wasn't finished with me yet. I burst from the mausoleum into the fog-choked cemetery, gasping for air, my flashlight swinging wildly. The whispers followed, louder than ever, twisting around me like the branches of the pines that surrounded the graveyard. Shadows darted between the tombstones, unnaturally fast, their elongated limbs reaching out to snag my jacket and hair. I ran blindly, tripping over roots and leaning gravestones, desperate to escape. Behind me, the pale figure from earlier reappeared, joined by dozens more, moving in a synchronized, eerie rhythm, their hollow eyes fixed on me. The whispers had changed. They were no longer pleas. They were commands. Join us. Forever. I stumbled into a clearing and saw the iron gates through the mist. Hope surged, but the shadows surged faster. One long, thin arm shot out and wrapped around my ankle. I screamed, kicking free, my flashlight illuminating dozens of tiny, pale hands reaching for me from every direction. It was then I realized that Pine Ridge Cemetery didn't just trap the dead. It claimed the living. I finally reached the gates and yanked them open, stumbling into the forest beyond. The whispers followed, echoing from the cemetery, fading only slightly as the distance grew. I didn't look back. Not once. My legs moving faster than I ever thought possible. Every shadow in the mist seemed to reach for me, urging me to stop, to turn back. The forest was dense and dark, but at least it was quiet. Almost too quiet. I ran until my lungs burned, my heart threatened to burst, finally collapsing beside the roadside. My flashlight flickered and died, leaving me in total darkness, except for the faint glow that lingered in the distance, from the cemetery I had just escaped. Even from afar, I could see shadows moving among the tombstones, and I knew the whispers would never fully leave me. Pine Ridge Cemetery had marked me. I had survived. Barely. Hours later, I finally reached my car parked at the edge of the forest. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the keys, every shadow between the trees seeming to move, stretching toward me. The whispers were faint now, but unmistakable, calling my name in tones that made my skin crawl. I glanced back toward the cemetery, and in the dim glow of the moonlight, I could see the gates slowly closing on their own, as if the cemetery were sealing itself again, waiting for its next visitor. I jumped into the car, slamming the doors shut. Even as I started the engine, I felt an oppressive weight pressing down on me, like the unseen presence from inside the mausoleum had followed me. My headlights cut through the fog, revealing nothing but the winding forest road. Yet, at the corner of my vision, shadows flickered, moving unnaturally fast, vanishing when I turned to look directly at them. I realized that no matter how far I drove, Pine Ridge Cemetery had already marked me. The drive back to town was silent, except for my own ragged breathing. Every bump in the road made my heart skip, and I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see pale hands pressing against it or ghostly figures following behind. But there was nothing, only the fog-laden road stretching endlessly ahead. When I finally reached a well-lit street in the nearest town, I exhaled in relief, convincing myself it was over. But later, reviewing the photos I had taken, I saw what the eye couldn't. Pale figures hiding among the trees, elongated shadows crawling over tombstones, and dozens of glowing eyes watching from the mist. The last photograph, taken as I drove away, showed dozens of hands pressing against the cemetery gates from the inside, reaching for me even from afar. I've never returned, and I never will. Pine Ridge Cemetery is alive, and it will wait forever. My name is Ethan Miller, and this happened when I was 27, during a weekend road trip through Alberta in 2020. I had always been fascinated by old hotels, particularly ones with dark histories. One that caught my attention was the Silver Creek Hotel, a decaying relic on the outskirts of a forgotten mining town. Locals avoided it, whispering of unexplained disappearances, doors that slammed on their own, and guests who checked in, but never checked out. Arriving at dusk, the hotel loomed over me, its weathered facade cracked and stained, windows clouded with grime. The wooden sign creaked with the wind, and a low mist hung in the air, curling around the foundation like pale fingers. I parked near the entrance and stepped onto the creaking porch, the air cold and heavy with decay. As I pushed open the front door, a musty scent of mildew and rotting wood filled my lungs. The lobby was empty, but the faint sound of piano music, off-key and distant, echoed through the hallways. Something about this place didn't feel abandoned. I stepped inside cautiously, my flashlight cutting through the thick gloom. The wallpaper was peeling, and the floorboards groaned under my weight. The piano music stopped abruptly as I entered, replaced by faint whispers that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. I spun around, flashlight beam darting across the lobby, but there was nothing, only dust motes suspended in the cold air. I made my way to the grand staircase, the banister splintered and worn. As I ascended, I noticed the guest rooms along the hallway. Some doors were open, revealing empty, decaying rooms. Others were closed, emanating a subtle, almost imperceptible hum, like a pulse of energy. When I reached the second floor, the whispers grew louder, overlapping into indistinguishable murmurs. Shadows moved along the hallway, flickering at the edge of my vision. My flashlight caught a brief glimpse of a pale figure standing in the farthest room, staring at me. When I focused fully, it vanished, leaving only an icy silence behind. I forced myself to continue down the hallway, each step heavier than the last. The whispers had evolved into a low, guttural chanting that seemed to reverberate through the walls, rattling the dust from the ceiling. Shadows flickered along the walls, stretching unnaturally, forming shapes that weren't human. My flashlight beam danced wildly across the peeling wallpaper, catching glimpses of movement in the corners of my eyes. One of the doors at the end of the hall swung open slowly, as if inviting me in. Inside was a guest room, completely dark except for a faint glow emanating from the closet. I approached cautiously, the wooden floor creaking under my weight. The glow intensified as I neared, revealing dozens of old, handwritten notes scattered across the floor, each one a desperate plea from past guests. They watch, they never leave. Help us. Suddenly the door slammed shut behind me, and the chanting intensified. swirling around the room like a vortex. I realized then that the hotel wasn't just haunted, it was alive. I tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged as the chanting grew louder, merging into voices screaming simultaneously in warning and anger. The closet door creaked open slowly, revealing a figure crouched inside. Its face was obscured, pale and blurred, but I could feel its gaze piercing through me. As I stepped back, the floor beneath me shifted slightly, as if the building itself were breathing. Shadows swirled around the room, reaching out with long, thin arms, wrapping around the furniture and stretching toward me. The notes on the floor seemed to move as well, fluttering upward like birds, circling the figure before settling back down. I realized the hotel was feeding off fear. It had trapped countless visitors before me, and it wanted another. The figure rose, elongating unnaturally, its limbs bending at impossible angles. My chest tightened, and I knew I had only one chance to escape before becoming part of the Silver Creek Hotel's twisted collection. I backed away from the closet, heart racing, my flashlight shaking violently in my hands. The figure rose fully, its body unnaturally tall, limbs bending in impossible ways, shadows stretching across the room like living smoke. The walls seemed to pulse, almost breathing, and the whispers morphed into deafening screams that rattled the broken windows. I could feel the energy of the hotel pressing down on me, tightening around my chest, making each breath a struggle. Desperate to escape, I bolted for the window, but the floorboards buckled beneath me, groaning and cracking, almost as if resisting my flight. The figure advanced, gliding silently toward me, its blurred face now clearer, twisted in a silent scream. I realized that every photograph I had seen in the lobby earlier, the old portraits of guests, weren't just decoration. They were warnings, evidence of those who had failed to escape the hotel's grasp. I leaped toward the exit door, praying it wouldn't slam shut like the others had. The figure stretched a shadowed hand toward me, and I felt the cold brush against my skin. I flung open the exit door and bolted down the grand staircase, the wooden steps groaning and splintering beneath my weight. Shadows stretched behind me, slithering up the walls, reaching with impossible speed, and the chanting followed me, echoing louder than ever. Dust and debris swirled around, and the faint echo of the piano music returned, slow and menacing. I reached the lobby, where the main doors yawned open into the night. The mist outside rolled in, thick and cold, crawling over the threshold as if trying to pull me back. I didn't hesitate. I dove through the doors and sprinted across the parking lot, my lungs burning. Behind me, the hotel seemed to sigh, almost sentient, as the shadows receded into the windows. The last glimpse I caught from the edge of the parking lot was of dozens of pale faces staring from the upper floors, mouths opening in silent screams, watching me leave. I knew then that Silver Creek Hotel was alive, and it would never forget my presence. Even after reaching my car, I could feel the pull of the hotel behind me. The mist clung to the lot like fingers, curling around the tires, the headlights cutting through it only partially. Every instinct screamed to drive away immediately, but something compelled me to glance back. The Silver Creek Hotel loomed in the darkness, windows glowing faintly as if lit from within by an otherworldly fire. Shadows moved across the walls, flickering, crawling, stretching in ways that defied logic. The pale faces I had glimpsed inside were now visible in the windows, dozens of them pressing against the glass, mouths opening and closing silently. Whispers rose from the building, more insistent now. "Return, stay, join us." My heart pounded, and my hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles whitened. I realized the hotel didn't just haunt its rooms, it haunted your mind. The terror it induced followed visitors far beyond its walls, lingering, waiting for the moment they felt safe enough to let their guard down. I drove slowly at first, glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figures chasing me. But the road behind was empty, swallowed by darkness and mist. Still, the air inside the car felt thick, suffocating, as if the hotel's presence had somehow latched onto me. Every bump in the road, every whisper of wind through the trees, felt like it carried voices from within the building. Hours later, I arrived at the nearest town, fully illuminated and bustling with life. Yet the tension in my chest did not fade. Every reflective surface I passed, mirrors, windows, even puddles, seemed to ripple faintly, hinting at figures lurking just beyond my perception. I realized with a chill that the Silver Creek Hotel never really let go. Its horrors were boundless, persistent, and patient. The memories of those shadows, the chanting, and the pale faces would remain with me forever. A haunting that no distance or light could erase. Even after hours on the highway, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The shadows of the hotel seemed to cling to my mind, whispering incessantly in my ear. Every reflective surface, a puddle, a store window, the rearview mirror, flickered with movement, faint glimpses of pale faces peering at me. My heartbeat was relentless, pounding so loud I was sure someone or something could hear it. Suddenly, my headlights caught a figure standing in the middle of the road, tall, pale, and impossibly thin, with limbs bent at unnatural angles. I slammed the brakes, swerving, and it vanished before I could see it fully. I realized then that the Silver Creek Hotel didn't just exist in one place. It could follow, embedded in the fear of anyone who entered. By the time I reached the safety of a well-lit town, I understood a terrifying truth. The hotel's presence didn't end with its walls. It followed, patient, waiting, whispering, always watching. Later, reviewing the photos I had taken inside the hotel, I saw the full extent of the horror. Figures lingered in every shot, some barely visible, others fully formed with twisted, elongated limbs. Faces pressed against walls, ceilings, and furniture, mouths moving in silent screams. One photo of the lobby showed dozens of shadowy silhouettes standing behind me, some with eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. The most chilling image, however, was taken from the grand staircase, a mass of pale figures stretching endlessly down the hall, reaching for the camera as if it had trapped me inside the photograph itself. I knew, without a doubt, that the Silver Creek Hotel had claimed their fear permanently, and that it had almost claimed mine. I've never returned, and I never will. The Silver Creek Hotel waits, patient, watching for the next traveler drawn by curiosity or foolish bravery. Its walls are alive, its shadows persistent, and its hunger eternal. My name is Lucas Reed, and this happened when I was 29, during a summer hiking trip in 2021. I had always been fascinated by abandoned industrial sites, and the Blackwater mines in northern Ontario had a reputation that drew me in. Locals avoided the area entirely, speaking of cave-ins, eerie lights, and miners who never returned. They said the mines were cursed, haunted by something ancient and unforgiving. Arriving at dusk, the entrance loomed before me. A yawning shaft leading into darkness, framed by rusting metal supports and jagged rock. The air smelled of damp earth and decay, with a chill that seeped into my bones. Mist crept along the ground, hugging the rocks like a living thing. I set up my gear, intending to explore cautiously, my flashlight cutting a narrow path into the mine. The deeper I went, the colder it became, and whispers echoed through the tunnels. soft at first, like wind through the rocks, then more insistent, as if the mine itself were speaking. The tunnels were narrow and uneven, walls slick with moisture. Every step echoed back to me, magnifying the oppressive silence. My flashlight illuminated old mining equipment, rusted carts, and scattered helmets, frozen in time as if the workers had vanished mid-shift. Whispers grew louder, overlapping in a way that made it impossible to distinguish one from the other. I noticed marks on the walls, scratch marks that weren't random, forming patterns I didn't recognize. As I moved further, faint lights flickered deep in the mine, glowing with a bluish hue, almost like lanterns. But no one was there. I tried calling out, but my voice was swallowed by the darkness. Suddenly, a metallic clang echoed from the depths, followed by a low rumble that shook the ground beneath me. My heart raced. The mine wasn't just abandoned, it was alive. Something moved in the shadows, following me, patient and deliberate. And I realized that whatever haunted Blackwater mines had been waiting for someone foolish enough to enter. I pressed on, flashlight shaking in my hands, each step echoing ominously through the mine. The walls narrowed, the air thick and oppressive, carrying whispers that were no longer distant. They were surrounding me, coming from every direction. I could hear faint breathing, uneven and ragged, though I was completely alone. My rational mind tried to convince me it was the wind or my imagination, but the chill crawling down my spine told me otherwise. Deeper in, I found old mining tunnels collapsed in sections, with jagged rocks forming natural cages. Among the rubble, faint footprints appeared in the dust, glowing faintly in the darkness, leading further into the blackened depths. Shadows moved along the walls, twisting unnaturally, stretching toward me as if trying to draw me in. Then I saw it, a figure emerging from a collapsed tunnel, humanoid but impossibly tall, with eyes glowing like coals. It didn't speak, yet the whispers in my mind screamed, "You shouldn't be here." Panic surged, but I forced myself to move forward, compelled by curiosity and fear. The figure remained still for a moment, then glided silently along the tunnels, always just out of reach. Every time I tried to focus on it, the shadows around me would shift, forming additional, indistinct figures, all following, all watching. The whispers intensified, overlapping in a chaotic chorus, pressing into my thoughts, making it nearly impossible to distinguish reality from hallucination. I reached a large cavern deep within the mine, its walls lined with mineral deposits that reflected the faint light, casting eerie, moving patterns. The air was almost suffocating, heavy with the smell of damp earth and something far fouler I couldn't identify. The figure stood at the center of the cavern now, and as I stepped closer, dozens of shadowy hands emerged from cracks in the walls, reaching, grasping, urging me toward the figure. It was then I understood. The curse of Blackwater mines didn't merely haunt, it consumed. I stumbled backward, my flashlight flickering wildly as the shadowy hands stretched toward me. The air felt alive, heavy, almost pulsating with a malevolent rhythm. The tall figure in the center of the cavern began to shift, its form bending and contorting, limbs extending unnaturally as if it were dissolving into the darkness itself. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but the mine seemed endless, every tunnel identical, looping back on itself in ways that made no sense. The whispers became voices, urgent and insistent. Join us, forever. My heart raced as I realized the mineral-lined walls were reflecting not only my light, but my fear, amplifying it, making me feel smaller, weaker, consumed. I bolted toward a faint light I glimpsed at the far end of the cavern, but the shadows thickened, rising from the floor like smoke, wrapping around my legs and arms. I could feel the figure's presence closing in, relentless. And I knew this mind didn't let anyone leave easily. Desperation fueled me as I pushed forward, tripping over jagged rocks and debris. The shadows seemed to follow every movement, climbing the walls, stretching across the cavern's ceiling, entwining like living smoke. The figure remained in the center, silent yet omnipresent, its glowing eyes locked on me, piercing through the dim light. The whispers had become screams inside my head, frenzied and chaotic, trying to break my sanity. I found a narrow side passage, barely visible, and squeezed through, stumbling into a lower tunnel that descended sharply. The darkness here was absolute, but I forced myself onward, hoping it led to an exit. Behind me, the cavern's echoes told a different story. The tall figure and the shadows were following, the sound of scraping rocks and moving stone resonating ominously. I realized that the curse of Blackwater Mines wasn't just about haunting. It was about claiming the living, marking them as its own, dragging them into a darkness that never ended. The tunnel ended abruptly at a massive underground chamber, its ceiling lost in shadow. Stalactites dripped steadily, and the air reeked of wet earth and something foul, almost like decaying flesh. The faint glow I had been chasing disappeared, replaced by a dim, sickly luminescence coming from the walls themselves. The shadows weren't just following me anymore. They were converging, writhing across the floor, reaching upward like a tide of darkness. In the center of the chamber, the tall figure waited, now surrounded by dozens of smaller, faceless shadows, all pulsing in unison. My flashlight illuminated scratch marks along the walls, forming patterns too precise to be natural, almost ritualistic. I realized these were not mere spirits. They were guardians, protectors of the curse, feeding off the fear of anyone who dared enter. A sudden crash of falling rock made me stumble, and the shadows surged, faster now, pressing closer, whispering, "You cannot leave." My mind raced. I had to escape, but every path forward seemed swallowed by darkness. I darted toward a narrow passage I hadn't noticed before, the shadows swarming in pursuit, scraping against my legs and arms. The chanting whispers had reached a deafening crescendo, vibrating through my skull. The tall figure advanced slowly, impossibly graceful, its glowing eyes fixed on me as if measuring my fear. I could hear dozens of smaller, whispering voices, all urging the same command. "Stay. Join us. Belong." The passage opened into a shaft leading sharply upward, slick with mud and rocks. I climbed frantically, my fingers bleeding from the rough edges, the shadows crawling over the walls like dark water. The glow from above intensified, providing a fragile promise of escape. Behind me, the figure hesitated at the shaft's edge, faceless shadows writhing, waiting, but unwilling or unable to follow. I finally reached the surface, gasping in the cool night air. The mine entrance loomed behind me, silent now, but I knew its curse had not ended. It had marked me. Once outside, I collapsed onto the damp ground, shivering violently. The night air was cold, yet it felt alive with whispers that lingered in my mind, faint but persistent. I dared a glance back at the mine entrance. From the darkness, I could see the faint flicker of shadows moving inside, as though the mine itself were breathing, alive and aware of my escape. My chest tightened with the realization that the curse didn't end with leaving. It traveled with you, embedding itself in your thoughts, your fears, and your dreams. I started walking toward my car, each step heavy with dread, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The woods around me were silent, yet every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig felt amplified, threatening to reveal the mine's lingering guardians. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief second, I swore I saw the tall figure standing among the trees, watching, waiting. The Blackwater mines had claimed countless victims before me, and it would claim more, patient and eternal. Later, reviewing the photos and videos I had taken, I saw what I could not while inside. Shadows twisted in impossible ways, forming figures that shouldn't exist, faces pressed against walls in silent screams, and the tall figure appearing in every frame, always closer than the last shot. In one image, dozens of pale, faceless forms seemed to reach outward from the walls, as if the mine itself was extending its grasp beyond the earth. The final photograph chilled me to the core. It was taken at the mine's entrance, showing my footprints leading away. But behind them, faint, ghostly shapes trailed, keeping pace. I realized then, the curse of Blackwater mines didn't only haunt the living, it followed them, marking them, binding them forever to the mine's dark, patient hunger. I've never returned, and I never will. The mine waits, silent and eternal, hungry for the next curious soul to wander into its depths.